The wild berries had been a brief, fleeting comfort, but the relief they provided was short-lived. The hunger gnawed at Ben's insides once again, more insistent and painful than before. Though the berries had sated him for a few moments, they were a mere shadow of what his body truly needed. It was becoming painfully clear that the wilderness had no intention of letting him off the hook so easily. Ben sat on the fallen log, his body aching from exhaustion and the cold that seeped into his bones. The storm had lessened slightly, but the rain continued to fall in steady, rhythmic drizzles, wetting his hair and running down his face. It felt like the sky was crying along with him. He wiped the droplets from his eyes, trying to focus. The berries had offered a brief sense of purpose, but now, he had to keep moving. The only way he would survive was to find more food, more shelter, and some form of direction. As he rose from his perch on the log, the familiar pain of hunger and fatigue hit him once more. His body screamed for rest, but his mind, the part of him that still held on to a shred of hope, urged him forward. Survival wasn't about waiting for things to get better. It was about pushing on, even when every part of you wanted to give up. Ben looked around. The forest was quiet, but not in the peaceful way he had once known. Now, it felt suffocating, as if the trees were closing in on him, pressing him into the mud and the wet ground. Every shadow seemed to hold something threatening, something that could either be his salvation or his undoing. It was hard to tell which. He adjusted his backpack, which felt heavier than before, the straps digging into his shoulders. His legs felt weak, his stomach hollow and aching. It was difficult to think clearly. He had become disoriented, the constant rain blurring his sense of direction. Was he even on the right path? How far had he wandered from the trail he knew so well? The fear of being completely lost began to settle in again, that creeping feeling of helplessness that he couldn't shake. He had always prided himself on his sense of direction, his ability to navigate through the wild with little more than a map and his instincts. But now, none of that seemed to matter. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was stumbling further and further away from any chance of rescue. A gust of wind ruffled the leaves above him, and Ben glanced up. The trees groaned and swayed under the pressure of the storm, their branches creaking in protest. He shivered involuntarily, pulling his jacket tighter around him. His body was growing colder by the second, his skin clammy and sticky from the wetness of his clothes. But the cold wasn't just a physical sensation anymore. It was a mental weight, slowly freezing his thoughts, his resolve. He needed to find shelter again, to get out of the rain before he became too weak to continue. But he also needed food. He knew that his body was on the edge of collapse, his legs had begun to shake from the strain, and his head felt like it was swimming. If he didn't find more food soon, he feared that he wouldn't have the strength to go on. Ben's thoughts began to spiral into a haze as he pushed through the underbrush, taking one step after another. His mind kept replaying the same thoughts: find food, find shelter, find help. But with each passing moment, it seemed more and more like an impossible task. The hunger, constant, gnawing, insistent, was his constant companion, and with it came a slow, creeping panic. His eyes darted around, scanning the forest floor for anything he could eat. He knew that foraging was dangerous, that not every plant in the wilderness could be trusted, but he had no choice. He needed to act. An hour passed, maybe more, before Ben stumbled upon a patch of wild herbs growing near the base of a tree. The green leaves and small, fragrant flowers seemed edible, and he recognized them from his previous hikes. They were safe to eat, he knew. They wouldn't satisfy his hunger for long, but they would give him enough sustenance to keep moving. He plucked the herbs and crammed them into his mouth, chewing quickly, almost desperately. The flavor was fresh and herbal, earthy, but it did little to alleviate the gnawing emptiness inside him. His stomach, still hollow, growled in protest. Ben pressed on. There was no time to linger, not if he wanted to survive. His thoughts raced as he pushed through the dense undergrowth. Every moment felt urgent. Each step felt like it took him further away from safety and deeper into the heart of the wilderness. The hours stretched on as he searched for more food. He came across a few more small patches of berries, some roots he could eat, and a few more edible plants. But none of it was enough. None of it could make up for the emptiness that had taken root in his stomach. The hunger was relentless, and he began to fear that it might break him before the wilderness ever would. Ben paused for a moment, hands on his knees as he tried to steady his breath. His legs were shaking from exhaustion, his mind clouded by the constant urge to eat. He knew he couldn't keep going much longer without more substantial food. His energy was depleted, and every move felt like it was draining him further. He needed to make a plan, to find something bigger, something that could fuel him long enough to escape the wilderness. That's when he heard it, a rustling. A snapping of twigs. His heart skipped a beat, and adrenaline surged through his body. He was so consumed by his hunger that he almost didn't register the sound at first, but now it was unmistakable. Something, or someone, was coming through the forest. Ben froze. He listened closely, his breath caught in his throat. The sound wasn't just the wind or the rain. It was deliberate, purposeful. The rustling grew louder, closer. Whatever it was big. Too big to be a bird or a small animal. His pulse quickened, and he instinctively reached for the stick he had been using to steady himself on the muddy terrain. The sound stopped suddenly, as if whatever it was had noticed him too. His heart raced as he crouched behind a thick patch of ferns, doing his best to blend in with the underbrush. His breath came in shallow gasps as he waited. The hunger, the exhaustion, all of it seemed to fade away as he focused intently on the sound in front of him. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the distant crack of thunder and the soft patter of rain, and then, just as quickly as the rustling had started, it was gone. The forest returned to its eerie stillness, and Ben's mind raced with questions. Was it a predator? A bear? A mountain lion? Or perhaps another human, someone who could help him? He couldn't be sure. The uncertainty gnawed at him. He waited for several more minutes, straining to hear any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Slowly, cautiously, Ben pulled himself out from behind the ferns. He scanned the area around him, eyes darting to every shadow, every corner of the forest. He saw nothing, but something felt off. The feeling of being watched, of being pursued, hung in the air. Ben couldn't shake the sense that the wilderness was alive with secrets he couldn't understand, and dangers he couldn't predict. His body was on the edge of collapse, his mind desperate for rest, but the instinct to keep moving, to search for food, for shelter, for safety, these things were stronger than the pull of exhaustion. As the storm clouds lingered overhead, and the sound of the wind whispered through the trees, Ben realized that he was no longer just surviving the wilderness. He was part of it now, its unpredictable rhythms, its dangers, and its mysteries. And it was showing him just how unrelenting it could be. With a final glance over his shoulder, Ben took one more step into the unknown. His survival was not guaranteed. But he had no choice but to continue. The wilderness had become his battleground, and he would fight, no matter what.